Little T Trauma, a limited series podcast by Lightcasting.
Hey Laura, how are you doing today?
Hey Krista, I'm really good, thanks. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to be here to see our new adventure take form, and I can't wait to tell people what we're doing here and what this is all about.
Me too. I'm so excited. I was like a little kid on Christmas morning, knowing that we were recording the first episode today.
Yeah, I couldn't sleep last night either. I heard your voice message this morning, so I was like, yeah, that was me up like every hour on the hour thinking about what we were going to say and what we're going to do and how we were going to explain people our new side venture that we're excited to be doing today. Yay for us. So I thought maybe what we would do is just explain to everybody who we are first and then get into what Little T Trauma podcast is actually about and what we're doing here. So why don't you tell the people who you are and what you do?
So I'm Laura Forbes and I'm a relationship coach. So I like to specialise in helping people to uncover what their patterns are in relationships. You know, the patterns that lead to choosing unhealthy relationship dynamics and repeating those patterns over, and to get into alignment with the healthy, secure, fulfilling relationships that a lot of people are looking for.
Yeah, you're doing literally God's work, basically.
Well, thank you. And how about you?
I know we thought we... Sorry, go ahead.
Why don't you tell the people what you do?
So I am in the same space of healing. My work is more related to religious trauma and wounding is where I got my start. And then I have a podcast called I'm Awake Now What, which really centers around spirituality, personal development, and healing. And that's kind of like the Venn diagram of where my focus is for the work that I do. And then I also run a spiritual podcast network, which this podcast will air on as well, called Lightcasting. So I'm the founder of that network and kind of just spend my days deep diving into existential questions with you all day long on our voice memos.
I was going to say, you're the most productive, busiest woman that I know, out there creating awesome body of work and still having the time to send me little daily podcasts on WhatsApp.
Yeah, we talk all day long on WhatsApp. So I think it might be good to tell people how we met too. I think, like you're obviously not American, which, is a tragedy, but that's okay. So, do you want to tell people how we met and how we're still friends years later?
Years later. I forget like the specific hows. I don't know whether you slid into my DMs or did I slide into your DMs, but it was via Instagram and it's going back a good 4, if not 4.5, 5 years ago that we connected on the gram. Our love of memes and all things healing.
Yeah, and that's really why we've probably stayed friends for so long, because we're really invested in sort of healing the collective from different entry points. And I had you on my podcast very, very early on at its very baby stages. So yeah. I appreciate you supporting me from all the way back then.
And ditto. Yeah, you were, I think, potentially the first podcast I ever did. And it was just at the beginnings. I think I was either just moving back or had just moved back to the UK after spending 8 years in Australia. And I wanted to, start my own business and really share the learnings and work that I'd been doing on myself over, previous years. And then, yeah, we connected and I got invited onto the podcast and the rest is history.
And it's been a beautiful friendship ever since.
The rest is in our WhatsApp history.
Why don't we tell... Yes, we do have like a clause in our friendship that says like, please delete upon death, untimely death, basically.
Yeah, destroy. Yes. Very important.
There's a lot of secrets in those WhatsApp messages.
There's a lot of secrets, a lot of breakdowns, breakthroughs, juicy conversations.
A lot of TMI.
Oh yeah, don't forget the TMI jingle.
Yeah, we invented a TMI jingle so that in case we are going to preface a story that has a little too much information, we can alert the listener to the fact that there might be some disturbing information coming through and you're not surprised on the other end.
Yeah, you might want to take it off speakerphone and pick it up.
Yeah, don't listen in the grocery store.
Big mistake.
So why don't we tell everyone now what we're doing with this podcast, how it came about. I think we've, for a long time, also been wanting to collaborate with one another and figure out how can we do that? What's a a funny, humorous way we can sort of meld our work together. And I think that's kind of where those were like the beginning ideas. But what is Little T Trauma Podcast about?
It's one of those things where we have such great, juicy conversations on the daily. And like you said, we're both involved in healing work in our day-to-day lives. We're doing stuff that can be quite serious sometimes. And there is obviously, like I said, we connected through our love of memes, right? And those memes kind of centered around the healing journey a lot of the time. So it is a really fun space. And I think for me anyway, this little endeavor that we're embarking on together is a way of kind of, showcasing some of the things that we've learned along our ways with that, lighthearted take on some things as well, right? Because healing and trauma can be quite a heavy subject, and not to take away from that, but just to, have a look at it from a little bit of a different angle that's accessible but also, uplifting and enriching.
Yeah, the healing work is it's just such a heavy word. And I think one of the things that I instantly really liked about you was that you always kind of took it with a humorous approach, and that yeah, it's heavy and sometimes it can be hard, but also it's kind of humorous that we're kind of bumping up against these things that trip us up, or really invested in changing, but sometimes that change can be really hard, and in that hardness there's a lot of humor too. So I really like that we're going to try to take this different approach to normalizing healing, normalizing addressing your trauma, and normalizing the little T trauma. So to explain to the listeners, there are two types there's a spectrum of trauma. So there's little T and big T trauma that is sort of, I think, collectively accepted in the world of psychology and self-help and personal development, where little T traumas are things that are traumatic events that don't necessarily impede us completely from being in the world and being able to interact with the world around us. And then on the other side of that spectrum is big T trauma that is really harmful and creates physical obstacles, mental obstacles in the way of us being able to connect or to live fully into the fullness of our human experience and shared journey. And then there's everything in between there. But we specifically want to talk about the little T traumas that are somewhat humorous, which we will get into in a little bit, and also normalizing that they do affect us. And, they don't necessarily have to always lead us down a path of deep inquiry, but we can look at them and also let them go pretty easily as well if we've got a good mindset. And I don't know if you want to add anything else there, Laura.
Yeah, I think like you said, it's about exploring those little things, right, that kind of signpost us to something deeper going on underneath. And sometimes, when you're in therapy or a coaching session and something comes up, often it will link back to something in childhood that, certainly that I found in the work that I do and in my own personal journey, on the surface seems quite insignificant, but can have such a massive impact on a person and their, psychology and how they're programmed and how they're then showing up in life and the results that's creating.
And then when we're little, because we don't have the language, the tools, and the wisdom to navigate the things that are happening to us, oftentimes okay, so I was going to say, yeah, oftentimes when we're little kids, we don't have the language or the tools, the resources or the wisdom to know these little things that you're talking about that can affect us, that they just seem so insignificant, like somebody calling you chubby when you're not really chubby, or somebody saying you're husky when you're not husky. Those weird little things just affect us in our adult life. And it's not until we take a compassionate, investigative look at it to say, is this really true? I think that's really what we want to be, pointing people to, is this really true, and can we let it go?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, those core memories, right, that stay with you. So something completely insignificant. So for me, I have trouble often remembering what I've had for dinner the day before or what I've done the day before. But there's certain things that stick with you, right, that you're God, I remember that thing really vividly, but I don't know why. Why do I remember that out of the whole, history of my life? And often it'll be because it's kind of highlighted in the subconscious as an important, significant event, right? A significant emotional event on some level. And like you said, often it takes a little bit of investigation to uncover what that is, because when we experienced those things at that time, we didn't have that kind of greater awareness or understanding or internal resource to unpack or process.
And I think there's also so much more information now with the dawn of the internet, with social media too, that I think people are very invested in changing patterns, even if they don't use that language, that there's just such a shift in everyone's mindset of like, well, we don't really have to do it the way our parents or grandparents taught us, because a lot of our behavior is steeped in those family systems that had really specific coping mechanisms, ways to deal with emotions, ways to deal with like, trauma and drama. And sometimes that, they just weren't the right tools for us. And we really need something different so we can be more free. And I think that's also probably a through line for both you and I. Like, we're really, really passionate about personal freedom, and personal freedom isn't just like, having a lot of money and like being free. It's also about being free of the things that like bog you down emotionally, right?
Yeah, I love that. I love that explanation. And it's expansion, right? So to me, freedom and expansion are kind of one of the same. And like, by expansion, I mean that growth, that ever like quest for more, right? Like learning, growing, which is kind of like, I'm a Sagittarius, so that's like top of my list of priorities, always has been. But I know obviously we connect on that too, right?
Yes, I'm a Cancer, and I'm also double water. So as you know, I at least call Laura once a day on our voice memos, and I am crying. I also do a cry alert, so she knows, because she is British. There is a stereotype of the stiff upper lip, but I think Laura does a lot better than most because she's very in tune as a coach. But I do let her know if I'm going to start crying on the voice memo.
Not today, babe. But yeah. I'm pretty sure I have a Cancer moon too, which I don't really know what that means, but
this is not an astrology podcast, clearly. I definitely believe in it, and I definitely believe there's some parts of it that really I think are undeniable,
100%.
But I don't understand it enough. Yeah, I don't understand it enough to really educate anybody right now. All right, so why don't we get into an episode of Little T Trauma, since we've got this nice, robust intro and people have come with us along at this point and we kind of know what we're doing here. So we're going to basically give you guys an example of a Little T Trauma and talk about how it's affected us, how we've worked through it, and then how we sort of notice it next time and try to pivot to different directions. So Laura has been gracious enough to bring her first example to the first episode. So I'm excited to get into this as we prepped for this episode. Was really funny.
My first of many, had a plethora to choose from. But yes, in keeping with the name of the podcast, so Little T Trauma, this one immediately springs to mind because it does involve tea. Obviously, like Krista said, I am British. But at this particular time in my life, I was living in Australia and I'd gone out for a hike with two really good friends. So on this hike, we were, just chatting, catching up. And these are friends that I felt really comfortable with. We were talking about relationship things. We were talking about our hopes and fears for the future. Anyway, we get back to one of my friend's houses and she's like, oh, would you two like a cup of tea? And I was like, yes, I would love that, please. I really, on this day, really strongly wanted a proper cup of tea, like English breakfast tea, right? In England, we just call it tea. But if you're outside of England, you have to call it English breakfast because otherwise people don't know what you're talking about for some reason. And so anyway, my friend served me up this tea, but she just gave me like a cup with like a tea bag in it, and then she took the tea bag out and it was just like black tea. And I was like, I want milk. But this is when the Little T Trauma comes into play. So I sat there for it felt like 5 minutes. It might not have been that long, but in my head I was going through this whole monologue of like, oh, I really want like milk with that. But she's not obviously offered me milk, so maybe she doesn't have any. And then obviously like my brain's going, well, you could ask for some milk. And I'm like, no, because if she doesn't have any milk, she's going to feel bad. And I know my friend is, quite healthy. So she's probably, going to have like milk alternatives, but that's not what I want in tea because it doesn't go very well. On and on this went. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to have to accept my fate and just drink the black tea, right? Probably like 45 seconds after that, my friend turned around and she's like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, like, do you want milk with that? And I was like, oh, yes, please. I was kind of aware of the discomfort I was feeling when I was going through that monologue in my head. But as soon as she asked and I felt this relief, then I was like, what was that about? And because, like I said, these are people that I feel really comfortable with. And it's like, if you can't even ask your friend who you're close to and comfortable with for milk, there's something going on there, right? A bit deeper. And so I decided to like share what I'd just gone through with these two friends. Because again, they were people that were, done self-work before. And we kind of started to unpack it and unpack, at this point in my life, there was a bit of a theme of not asking for what I want, not feeling comfortable to make requests or to, ask for what I need. And also, if we look below that as well, is this kind of projection or assumption of what people are going to be, what people are doing or thinking.
Yeah.
Or their like motives and stuff. And another key thing when I was thinking about this story to, bring it to the podcast is something else that's interesting when it comes to trauma, which is the generalizations that we make. So like the brain obviously only has a certain capacity, so it cannot process all the information at one time. And so like it'll delete, generalize and distort information to make it more manageable. And so throughout this whole process of like wanting the milk but not asking, I'd completely deleted the fact that my friend is married to a big, tall, strong, strapping surfer dude who, of course, would have milk in the fridge, right? So it was just like ridiculous on loads of different levels. But that's my little T trauma origin story, I guess.
Well, and it's interesting too, like the story dialogue that initiates immediately when you tell yourself no. Because that's usually I think like that's a really natural step when we have those little T trauma pings come up. Then there's like an immediate no, I can't have this thing, or no, I can't do this, or because somebody has told me this or that or the other, the inverse of it is not possible. And then you start in this like rigmarole of a dialogue and of assumptions, like you were saying, like, and it's just so wild that we're all wired to do that.
Definitely. And it's like, it's such a, I was talking before about like, I really value freedom and expansion, but going through life with like that kind of handicap, right? Like that kind of mindset that's kind of restricted and kind of boxed in is not expansive at all. And there's, not as much freedom there as there is once you start to unpack those things and, resolve them.
It's multi-layered too, which I think is also what's hard when you're addressing trauma, whether it's little t or small t. There's all of these layers. And I like to think of those layers as like your gender, your family, society, culture at large. Like there's all these things that are contributing to that overall response to something like that. But for you, do you think it was part cultural? Was it because in your family system, you weren't used to asking for what you want? Was it gender related? Because as women, we are very conditioned to not ask for too much. So where did you tickle out on not tickle out? Where did you I don't know why I said tickle. My brain just gave up on me. Oh God. On those, where did you shake out of discerning where was the impact there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's probably like multiple contributing factors to that. I think a large one was, I think, maybe from the family system growing up, I was kind of quite independent at a young age. And so I had this whole thing of like not wanting to ask for help. And again, that might be a British thing. It might just be a, familial thing. And again, the contrast of Australians. So I remember like getting there and having my Australian friends being like, whatever help you want, like ask for it, if you need a place to stay. And like, I'm the kind of person, if I was going somewhere, I would like get a taxi rather than ask for someone to pick me up from like the station. Because again, maybe British, maybe the hyper independence, not wanting to inconvenience someone, I think is a big part of that too. And so that was
that's a big one for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So like kind of that cultural difference of Australians being very much like, it. And then not to say that British people aren't like that too, because I think, there's plenty of examples that they are, but, I guess just kind of my vision of growing up kind of thing of how things were done or whatever. I really don't know the specific of that answer. But I think people-pleasing tendencies, factor in there too, as in not wanting to inconvenience someone or not want to make someone feel bad, right? So I was prepared to kind of forego one of my needs being met so that I didn't, potentially make someone else feel bad. Like, when that wasn't even a potentiality anyway, right? Because if she didn't have had any milk, she would have just been like, no, sorry, I don't have any milk. And it's, like, I'm sure she wouldn't have felt bad about that. But for some reason, that's kind of like the programming that I had around that whole situation.
Yeah, and I think you're also calling out something really interesting here too, is how with the lens in which we view the world when we're coming to situations with our own lived experiences, whether they're traumatic or not, we're always making all of these assumptions about everyone else. And it's like, even if you had asked for the milk, I don't think she probably would have been offended, right? She would have just been like, oh gosh, I forgot to get you. Oh my gosh, you're British. You definitely need milk in your tea because that's how you guys do it.
Yeah.
So like, and that for whatever reason, your mind was like, I don't want to offend her because, or what if she doesn't have it and then she feels bad? And it's like, well, why would she feel bad?
Yeah, right. And I think like what you're just saying there is like pointing to our model of the world, right? We all have this kind of map of reality that's not necessarily based on the actual facts and possibilities, but based on, our assumptions, our beliefs, our programming around growing up, our values. And like I think we kind of touched on at some point was around, Brene Brown has that saying of, the story I'm telling myself is. And like that's really important, I think, in terms of what we're kind of talking about here is like the stories we tell ourselves around, that. So I was telling myself a story of my friend's going to feel bad if I ask for something that she can't provide. Where did I learn that? Right. Like,
yeah. And there's just so many layers and degrees in which you could take that self inquiry and obviously always in a gentle and compassionate way to uncover where that is. So in thinking about that for you, where did you end up deciding, like, of the things that were making the most, I guess, like uncomfortableness, whether it was like not wanting to upset her, the people pleasing, or even the not being able to ask for what you want? What were you able to resolve once you looked at that situation? And you were obviously talking to your friends about it too. So you were saying to them, like, I can't believe I'm going through this thing, which we talked about before we recorded. Like there was somebody who you could say, like, this is the story I'm telling myself. So for you, where did you end up deciding where did most of the care in resolving that little T trauma go to for you?
Yeah, so for me, it was really about starting to honor my own needs rather than kind of minimizing those needs. Something as simple as not even necessarily a need, right, but a preference for some milk in the tea. I couldn't even feel comfortable with close friends that I'm comfortable with to voice that. So map that out further afield. It's going to be very problematic for me, right? With that, I started to kind of go, wow, I really need to do something about this. And I think that's what helped me kind of highlight that on that day was, that sense of external safety was there. And so my, old programming, the old pattern, adaptation strategy, right, was no longer needed and it seemed necessary. Out of place. Yeah, it's no longer necessary. And that allowed me to see, like, here's something that's really outdated and not serving me. So, what's the next step, right? Like, and for me, that was around, exploring. And because I think, many people can probably relate to this too, is after a lifetime of kind of suppressing or minimizing your needs and desires and preferences, sometimes you don't even know what they are anymore, right? So it's kind of then a journey to start to unravel all of that.
I love what you said there. And I think it's an important thing to underline with anyone who's trying to do this work is making sure that you are in safe places with safe people, because what you're practicing there and what our best friend Brene Brown always says is a really deep level of vulnerability to our bestie. Hey, bestie. A deep level of vulnerability that can't always be practiced in certain spaces with certain people, because it is like being in the same grade as somebody. If we were to like use this as an analogy, like, you and I are in the same grade. We're obviously master levels right here, or PhD, but but when you're having those vulnerable experiences where you are really wanting to be honest about what's happening to you, can't really always lay that down with like your family who doesn't really want to talk about stuff, or your partner who's not on that same level. So it's always important to try to practice moving away from those patterns that don't serve you anymore, like you said, in places that are safe, that can receive that vulnerability from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, coming back to the nervous system, right? Feeling safe is essential to be able to be in a position to do these things and explore these things. For many people, how to regulate your nervous system was not something that was kind of talked about growing up, right? Or
No.
For many people, still not, they don't have any idea. So, like you said, having people, whether that's people that you have to seek out and pay for that level of regulation, or you've managed to surround yourself with like friends or some family members or a partner that has that understanding and awareness, so that you can have those regulated experiences and then feel safe to get those deeper insights.
The nervous system is such a integral piece of the healing process that, again, it's not something, unless you go on this journey, you're really interacting with, because especially here in the Western world, we are very prone to just like addressing all the symptoms, but not looking at the holistic components, or all of the moving parts, and take a holistic view of what's going on. And a lot of us grow up in systems that require our nervous system to always be firing or activated. And then we seek out those patterns again. But once you start to practice regulating your nervous system and teaching it safety from within, that's like a huge game changer, I think, on the healing journey. And maybe we'll have to have like a nervous system expert come on and talk about just that alone.
Yeah, I wonder if Gabor's free.
Our other bestie.
Our other bestie, Gabor. When you were saying that, I was just thinking, he explains it really well, right, in terms of authenticity versus attachment. He often talks about when we're born, we have two needs, like the need to be authentic, which is to express ourselves and to be seen, heard, understood, and loved, and feel safe in that expression. And then obviously the need for attachment, right? A baby can't survive without its parent or a caregiver. So attachment is essential for survival. And what can happen as we go through life is that trade-off, right? At some point, there's a situation that feels unsafe. And so we learn that to get our needs met or to survive in that environment, we need to kind of minimize ourselves, minimize our needs or desires or preferences or self-expression to prioritize attachment over authenticity. And I think, in that moment with the little tea example is, in that moment I was like, because what was the fear, right? If I asked and she felt bad, then that might jeopardize, that connection, or that might then jeopardize her availability, right? If she was going to, feel upset, and then how would she deal with that? Obviously, that was all in my head and not necessarily the reality of the situation. But I think kind of unpacking it is what was going on, right? That trade-off for my authenticity and desire kind of getting put in a little box for let's maintain equilibrium and connection and safety in that moment, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the crux of it. It's the fear, and then the authenticity and attachment piece are just so integral in trying to understand why is this happening? Why are we taking this pathway when these kinds of things come up? So that's a really, really good point. All right, so we're wrapping up at the end here. We want to try to keep these podcasts about 30 minutes apiece, so they're bite-sized, but they're powerful, and that we are giving people some things to think about. But we did want to remind everybody, so this is a new podcast limited series. We're going to go ahead and issue the first 2 episodes back to back, so you can have those 2 as binge-worthy up front. Next week, we'll be talking about my little tea trauma, which is, I think, hilarious and really, but also took me a long time to get through. And then we also want to invite you guys to write into us, tag us on social media if you want us to talk about your little tea trauma. We've also got an email address that you can email your little tea traumas to, and we'll read them on the show in the following segments. But we really wanted to use this first episode to set up like a baseline, introduce ourselves, tell you what we're doing here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Laura for anything else she wants to say as we wrap up here.
So yes, I hope everyone had fun listening, as much fun listening as we had recording this episode. And we would love to have you back here for our next little tea trauma chat.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We're so excited to be doing this with you guys and to be going on this little adventure of Little T Trauma podcast. And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you have a Little T Trauma you'd like Laura and Krista to help you with, send it to littlettraumapodcast@gmail.com to have it featured on the show. Make sure to rate, review, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can follow Little T Trauma on the Lightcasting YouTube channel. Little T Trauma is a Lightcasting production. Music by Score Wizards. Editing, directing, and post-production by Krista Xiomara. Lead vocals by Laura Forbes and Krista Xiomara.